Greetings, I'm Thomas Hazlett, Hugh H. Macaulay Endowed Professor of Economics at the Johnny Walker Department of Economics here at Clemson University. I'm also director of the Information Economy Project. And thank you for attending today's Tullock lecture. This lecture is named for Gordon Tullock, a great scholar, and in his name we bring to Clemson great scholars who have deep expertise and diverse perspectives on how information is used in society. We aim to provoke thought, study, controversy, and new ideas, just as did Professor Tullock. Being keen to understand how the information economy and its component parts are evolving, we reach out to thinkers and doers able to help us in our quest. Today we are delighted to hear from one of the great public intellectuals in America today, Deirdre McCloskey. To introduce her to you, I will soon turn the podium over to Robert McCormick, Dean of the College of Business. Before I do that, however, please allow me to point out that Professor McCloskey will speak for perhaps 45 minutes to an hour, or however long she wants to speak. And then we'll entertain questions. This lecture is being recorded, and the video will be posted tomorrow at iep.clemson.edu. There it is, iep.clemson.edu, right in the middle of the slide. By the way, that's the only slide you will see today. Finally, I note that you will have a chance to meet Professor McCloskey immediately after her talk, when at about 6:30 we convene to the foyer for refreshments. So now it's my pleasure to give you Dean McCormick of the Clemson University College of Business.
Good afternoon to you all. It's a beautiful day in Clemson. It's almost always fun to be asked to introduce a speaker, but tonight is both fun and a classical honor for me for two reasons. One of them is Dr. McCloskey, but hold that thought. Let me first offer some praise to Dr. Tom Hazlett and the faculty in the John Walker Department of Economics via the Information Economy Project for arranging and sponsoring the Gordon Tullock Lecture Series. As Tom mentioned, Gordon Tullock was a rare economist since he was actually a lawyer. Not a quiet or reserved man, Gordon influenced almost everyone he met and many others. We honor him, his perspicacity, his wit, his charm, his intellect, some would argue about his charm, and more with his lecture. I will always remember my absolute most favorite Tullockism. To say a situation is hopeless is to say that it is ideal. Not tonight. Let me turn to our honored speaker. As a student of reason and microeconomic theory as expressed in English that humans other than economists can also read and understand, I've been a fan of Dr. Deirdre McCloskey for more than 4 decades. I came to love economics because, as she once wrote, quote, economists are tellers of stories and makers of poems, and there seems to be 2 ways of understanding things, either by way of metaphor or by way of a story. Now, perhaps many of my colleagues in economics faculty here and others can and will disagree with me, but metaphor and story are what made me love and produce in economics, so be it. Deirdre was formally educated in economics at Harvard, both undergraduate and graduate. Soon after, she succumbed to the siren that was then economics at the University of Chicago, and Al Harburger just reminded me that he's the one that hired her, so we have boss and student right here, employee right in front of us today. Later at the University of Iowa, Dr. McCloskey was the John Murray Professor of Economics and History, where she published the famous Rhetoric of Economics. Probably my favorite work of hers, though, is Applied Theory of Price. She's written 15 other books and countless 400 more articles on a wide breadth of topics. Of recent fame and note is the trilogy sitting in front of you here on culture and society, if you will, the bourgeois era, a collection I encourage you to read, especially the third volume on ideas. While Matt Ridley and even I might disagree some, I dare you to read it and not be stimulated very deeply. As Matt himself said of the first volume a few years ago, I'm quoting Matt now, "The book radiates intelligence and insight and will illuminate my thinking for years to come." It is often said that life is about the journey and not the destination. Few have had the journey that is Deirdre McCloskey. Aside from her phenomenal intellectual contributions, her personal story is a source of both sorrow and joy. If you wish to delve deeply into that story, I invite you to partake of her book, Crossing, a Memoir. You will be both moved and educated. A lot of people helped me learn to enjoy writing, but 3 people taught me that writing well mattered, well, actually 4. Ernest Hemingway, George Stigler, Bob Tollison, and our guest tonight, Deirdre McCloskey. Nobel laureate Stigler once wrote that economic writing obeys the first law, by which he meant, in English, that people would write more, read more of your work if you wrote it well. My guess is that he got that quote, if not that sentiment, from Deirdre. It's a rare and wonderful day in Clemson to have her here for our enjoyment and enlightenment. So with humility and pride, I give you Dr. Deirdre McCloskey, the Distinguished Professor of Economics History, English, and Communications at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Deirdre.
Thank you very much for that generous and incorrect introduction. I have a speech defect. I've always stuttered since I was little, so occasionally I'll stutter. 2% of the born men here stutter. 0.5% of the born women do. So if I stutter or sound funny, don't worry. Marilyn Monroe was a stutterer. That's why she talked in that funny way. You know how she talked? That was to make it easier to be fluent. So I'm not Marilyn Monroe, alas, but I am an economist and a historian, something of an amateur philosopher and a student of sociology and history. And I've completed last year a trilogy. Now, actually, I was intending to write 6 volumes on this. The first 2 are 500 pages each. So, you know, that's a lot. And then this final one is 700 pages because I decided to compress it into a trilogy. Now they're both available in paperback. All 3 are available in paperback, and indeed they're available as audiobooks. But my problem was that I had finally gotten it down to 4 planned volumes, but I said to myself, a trilogy might be considered somewhat, I don't know, self-indulgent, a little bit silly, but a tetralogy, which means 4, is an abomination. So I wasn't going to do that. So that's why the 3rd volume is so thick. And the story that the 3 volumes tell is very easy to summarize. It is that what we normally call capitalism, which I would prefer to call commercially tested innovation, is not, first, spiritually corrupting. That's basically what the first volume is about. It says that you can have a full life in commerce, in management, or whatever. You can be a consumer and a worker and whatever, CEO, as everyone here is going to be someday. And it won't corrupt your soul. Because as Jesus said, what does it matter if you gain the world and lose your soul? Now, I'm an Episcopalian, a Christian, if you call a progressive Episcopalian a Christian. And I believe that it's really important to know whether capitalism is corrupting. Now, a lot of people believe it is. They believe that if you buy low and sell high, actually Gandhi, the great Mahatma Gandhi said, buying low and selling high is the most evil thing I've ever heard. Well, maybe he didn't know a lot of evil people. I don't quite understand this. But anyway, buying low and selling high. Prophet, said his follower, Nehru in India, profit is a dirty word. And if that were true, then I wouldn't be an enthusiast for capitalism. Believe me, if I thought that you all, when you go out into the business world, are going to lose your immortal soul, I would urge you to not go into the business world. I'd urge you to become monks or nuns, or anyway, something else than an active participant in a market economy. So the first volume is about, it's called The Bourgeois Virtues. The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And I use the word bourgeois, which is simply the French name for a townsperson, for a middle-class person, as most of us consider ourselves to be, because I want to lean against its use, especially on the left, among socialists, as a term of contempt. The sophisticated Manhattanite girl who's 12 years old and her father won't let her go on a sleepover, she says to her father, "Oh, Daddy, you're so bourgeois." Bourgeois is a swear word in our culture, and I don't think it should be. It should be reinstated as the kind of person that everyone in this room aspires to be. An educated person who lives by her mind and her writing and her calculating. That's why you guys and gals need to learn how to write. That's what a bourgeois person does. Also, speaking is terribly important to the bourgeois life. If you're going to graduate from Clemson and spend your life, I don't know, on the chain gang, then you're not going to need to be eloquent. But if you're going to do anything else, teaching, for example, or being in business, you have to learn to speak in public. So these bourgeois people are very far from contemptible. And there's a tendency, though, to say that anyone who's not a noble, an aristocrat, or a saint, a church person, is thereby less ethical. We speak, and I find this very disturbing, about wanting to go into the non-profit sector. Lots of you will say that. Because somehow, as I said before, you think that profit is dirty, or at least Nehru did. But it's not dirty. Buying low and selling high, which is earning profit, makes the world better off. It moves whatever you bought low from a low value use to a high value use. And you earn a little profit from it. You don't earn much if there's free entry to that profession, if the government hasn't stopped entry by according to the 1,000 occupations in the United States that have state-issued licenses. Hair braiding requires you to go to school. This is crazy, but that's the condition we're in. But in any case, earning profit is not evil. It's good. It's service. We have a habit that we've gotten into in the United States, which I object to, of thanking military people for their service. Now, I know that in South Carolina the military is popular, and I'm not against that. I think it's nice. I had an argument with your senior senator, Lindsey Graham, and I said, Senator Graham, I don't see why we need 800 overseas bases. And he said, if we don't fight them in Iraq, we'll fight them in Charleston. Well, maybe. But in any case, I'm perfectly willing to honor military service. But wait a second. The person who serves you a hamburger at McDonald's is serving you. The person who takes care of your baby while you go to school is serving you. The person who invents the iPhone is serving you. Now, that they get paid is not shocking, because so do the soldiers get paid. So there's this kind of, there's an aristocratic character to our honoring of the military. The military are knights, are defenders. And ordinary people, like most of us are then thought to be not doing service. Well, that's crazy. The whole basis of a capitalist society is that we serve each other. If you do work specialized in some occupation, and your neighbor does another kind of work, and you exchange with each other, both of you are better off. This is something that Donald Trump doesn't get. He thinks that the only way to make the United States better off is to make Mexico or China worse off. And that's childish. The world is not zero-sum. We can make us all better off by serving each other for pay. So I go through the standard virtues, the virtues of Western civilization, which are prudence, justice, courage, temperance. Those are called the cardinal virtues or the pagan virtues. And then faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love, which are called the theological or the Christian virtues. Not, I'm afraid, because Christians exhibit them all the time, but they do talk about them a lot. And 4 plus 3 is 7. And those are the 7 traditional virtues of the West, of Europe. Now, other cultures have essentially the same list of virtues. In South Asia, in their great epic tradition of the Hindus, they talk in these same terms, naturally. Because this idea of these 7 virtues is a pretty good philosophical psychology. Not perfect, I mean, you might want to change words here and there. But the advantage of thinking this way, it's called virtue ethics in the philosophy department. It's not utilitarianism you learn in business school, or Kantianism you learn in the philosophy department. It's something else. It's the talk of the individual virtues using the library behind each of these words. Prudence, for example, is the virtue of economics. Economics is the theory of pure prudence. Prudence being the executive virtue, know-how, savoir-faire, as the French say. So there's prudence and temperance, which means balance in the single personality, in the individual personality. Justice, which means balance and appropriateness in the society as a whole, and courage. Now, those are the four cardinal virtues, and then faith, hope, and love. Now, understand, an East Asian society has essentially the same set of virtues. My point in that book is that there are commercial versions of these. Let's take entrepreneurship, something that's greatly admired in the modern world, especially in the United States. And entrepreneurship is a combination of the virtue of prudence, right? Knowing how to get stuff done, and courage, a commercial courage. Courage is not just battlefield courage. The mom who gets up every day to help her severely handicapped son is exercising courage of a high order. And so too is the entrepreneur who also has the virtue of hope. Hope is not just a Christian virtue. It's the virtue of having a project. If you really don't have a project in life, I worry about you. Because I worry you're going to go home this evening, please don't do it, and shoot yourself. Don't do it, please, please, for God's sakes. Because people need projects. They need, we say on the common tongue, something to look forward to. Faith is identity, where you come from. It's a backward-looking virtue. If you're faithless, you're Paris Hilton. And you don't have any identity at all. You're just kind of going to Cannes for the season and sashaying around and being in the scene. And love is the attachment, of course, to my dog named Will Shakespeare. I love my dog, and that's perfectly okay. He's kind of old and ill, but still, I love him. Inconvenient though he is. But love is also love of the transcendent, of higher things, of science, or history, or the Tigers. Go Tigers! Or the family, higher things. So you see that these virtues can be exercised in a commercial society. And I go through them all and show that that's true. I mean, factually true, not just theoretically, just not, well, you could have a commercial version of faith or especially hope, but well, I don't know. No, I try to show it. In the second volume, it occurred to me, I mean, this trilogy is basically a defense of capitalism. But it's a defense that's not meant to just speak to the choir. It's not just meant to speak to my old friend Al Harburger here. He and I agree that capitalism is good. Well, okay, but if I don't need to persuade Al, but I need to persuade lots of people, especially intellectuals. I call them the clerisy. The journalists who don't understand that the problem in Venezuela is not just, I don't know, inflation and shortages which have somehow magically appeared, but is the attempt to apply thoroughgoing socialism to what was once a very successful capitalist economy. So, I realized, I remember the day that this came to me, that my defense of capitalism was also an explanation of capitalism. That capitalism, since its the version we're dealing with right now, came to be starting in the 18th century, the 1700s, has been fantastically successful for the poor. You hear a lot about inequality and how rich people are and how terrible that is, and how you ought to take the money from them and, and give it to the poor. And I'm not entirely against that, because my whole purpose in life as an economist is to make the poor better off. I don't mind if the rich get more money, but I want them to get it from inventing good stuff for the rest of us. And then I want them to not be able to stop entry, that's the word we use in economics, that dissipates the rent. You can impress your economics instructor by using that phrase. Entry dissipates rent. And you don't even have to know what it means. Just say it to your economics instructor, and she'll be thrilled. She'll think, this kid's really got it. So I decided that virtues, and here's the crucial point, acknowledgement of virtues in other people, in the bourgeoisie, in these merchants and manufacturers, acknowledging it is a new fact of history in the West. Now that's a crucial point. I'm not saying that people got better by the 1700s. I'm not saying that they, once they didn't pursue profit, and then they woke up one day and said, I could make a lot of money if I were greedy. There's this program on TV called American Greed. And it's kind of silly because it sort of talks as though there's some new greediness in the United States. But in fact, all societies have been greedy. All societies, in every society, people want more. Now, there are saints among us, and I admire them, who don't want more. But most people want more, whatever it is, food or housing or entertainment or something. So there is this deep human quality. You can call it greed, but all it is prudence without the other virtues, the other 6 virtues in attendance. If you're only prudent, which tends to be the model we use too much in economics, just by itself, then you can fall into greed instead of a virtuous prudence balanced by the other virtues. So anyway, the point is that I think there was a change in the attitude towards the market, towards innovation, towards entrepreneurship, towards people in business, towards managers, towards people in the economy. And it happened rather suddenly. At first in Holland, in the Low Countries, in the 1600s, and then at the end of the 1700s in England, there was a rather sharp change, which you can document. And that's what the other 2 volumes are about. To put it another way, I'm explaining how rich we got. It is amazing what happened in the last 200 years. Nothing like it had come close to happening anywhere. In Song China, or the glory of Greece and the grandeur of Rome, you might occasionally get a doubling of income per head. But what's happened in the last 2 centuries, and everyone in this room is an example of it, is an increase in income per head. Now hear the figure. Hear the figure. Feel it on your pulse. 3,000%. Compared with your great grandparents, you are 3,000, a factor of 30%, not 30%, but factor of 30, better off in the amounts of goods and services that you can have. For example, I've got artificial hip joints because I have had arthritis in my hip joints. Well, my grandparents, if they got arthritis in their hips, they would end up in a chair and they would die. I have 8,000 books. Actually, my theory is that she who dies with 10,000 wins. So send more books. But 8,000 books, by the standard of the 19th century, even 100 years ago, is a very big personal library. Henry David Thoreau, the great American writer and naturalist. His first book that he published didn't sell well. 700 copies were printed, only 200 sold. And his publisher said, "Henry, I'm going to pulp the 500 books unless you buy them from me." Pulping means you turn the paper back into raw material for more paper. And so Henry bought them all. He was fond of saying, "I have a library of 1,000 books, half of which I wrote." So the change is just remarkable from as recently as 1900 or even 1950. Or let's take 1940. I was born in 1942, so this was a couple of years before I was born. It's about the same there. Average income in the United States, in real terms, allowing for inflation and everything, and what we call purchasing power parity in economics, was about that of present-day Brazil. So we've moved from 1940, from present-day Brazil, about $33 a day, to present-day America, about $130 a day for every man, woman, and child in the country. But in 1800, American income per head was about $6 a day. And that was above the world average. The world average in 1800, now hear this, was $3 a day. Try living in Clemson on $3 a day. You wouldn't have very much to eat. Your clothes would be tattered. You'd be sleeping rough. Come on. But $3 a day is not unusual in the world. There are many countries still, Chad, for example, or this country we just learned about, Niger, I guess it's pronounced, where it's $3 a day. So look, the change from $3 or $6 a day to over $100 a day is a heck of an increase. It's amazing. And here's how it goes. Look, let me draw a diagram. We economists love diagrams. And I'm going to talk about income per head for every man, woman, and child on the globe. And I'm going to make this, well, let's see, how am I going to do this? Let me make the floor 0 and make this distance about 2 inches, $3 a day. I'm going to start here at 200 BCE, which is the beginning of the human race. There's only one race in the world. Everyone in this place is from Africa, by the way, in case you didn't know. My people left Africa about 30,000 years ago and turned left. Okay, so there we go, $3 a day, it bumps along. Now this is 200,000 years, right? 200,000 years, it's down at the floor, you know. $3 a day, $3 a day, $3 a day. About, I don't know, we'll make that the end. About here we have the agricultural revolution, which briefly raises the income per head, but then entry, expansion of the human population, a la Parson Malthus, brings it down back to $3 a day, which is subsistence. So it goes along for, we're talking about 5,000 BCE, goes along. Here's our Lord and Savior is born about here. And here we are in 1800. And then it goes like this, dears. Now watch, this is very scientifically important and very accurate. It goes like this. It goes. It increases, I said, by 3,000%. 3,000%. Doubling is 100%. This is 3,000%. So what's the explanation for that? The great Adam Smith, now I always cross myself when I mention the great Adam Smith, who you should read. The great Adam Smith spoke in his book of 1776 of the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And I've explained it. Those other economists haven't. They're all mistaken, and I am correct. And there are two kinds of economists, there are two kinds of theories of how he got so rich. One is from the left side of the usual political spectrum. The socialists and the Marxists and the people on the left, they say it's exploitation. Let me give you a controversial example that'll kind of shock you. In the second inaugural address, Lincoln has this beautiful passage where he talks about how long there's been slavery in the United States and how long the income of the rest of the people has been extracted from the toil of African Americans. And he implies, his economics there, is that slavery made the United States. Now, slaves, of course, were workers, and they produced a lot. But slavery wasn't essential to the growth of the United States. And if you believe it was, if you believe, as some recent books have said, that cotton and slavery are mixed with each other, and if you had to have cotton in the Industrial Revolution, that means that slavery was crucial to it, you're misled. As an economic historian, I can show that cotton has basically nothing to do with slavery. There were plenty of free white people, and free black people for that matter, before the Civil War who grew cotton. And the South produced, 5 years after the end of the Civil War, as much cotton as it produced on the eve of the Civil War. So it's simply not true that slavery was necessary for cotton. Now, I'm not talking in favor of Jim Crow or the reimposition of serfdom on African Americans. I'm very much against it. But slavery didn't cause the great enrichment. I mean, it kind of stands to reason. You can see that if you own someone else, that might raise your income, I don't know, 50% or even 100%. But it's not going to raise your income 3,000%. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. Another version of this tale is imperialism. That Europe grew rich, this is the left-wing tale. Europe grew rich because of extracting income from the rest of the world. And you've heard this in lots of your courses by my friends in the English department and so forth. And it just ain't so. It's false. The British Empire, for example, of which there have been a great many studies, was a burden on the average English person. The extractions from India were trivial after the 1700s. Now that doesn't mean the Indians were made better off by this. They may have been hurt, but I'm just saying that the benefit to average English person was not the same thing as the damage of imperialism to India. Take the worst colonialism that there was, which was probably Portuguese. And it's still Portugal with this big empire, the earliest European empire, overseas empire in Africa and elsewhere, was one of the poorest countries in Europe until recently. So having an empire doesn't make you rich. That's on the left. But I have a lot of friends on the right who are conservatives. And they say, we got rich from savings. We got rich from accumulation. This argument also figures on the left because they reckon that the bosses steal the money and then use it to build up industry. But let's set that aside for the moment and go back to the right wing. The right says the bosses abstain from consumption. They're so virtuous. And they use their abstention from consumption. They don't buy that second car. And instead they invest it in their business. And that's what made us rich. Now, as a great economist with whom I don't always agree, John Maynard Keynes, the great English economist, said, this would cause diminishing returns if there was no innovation in the meantime. If there were no new and profitable buy low, sell high projects invented in the meantime, adding brick to brick, bachelor's degree to bachelor's degree, doesn't make you rich by a factor of 30. It makes you better off. Stay in school. You'll be much better off than your friends who drop out, and especially your friends who only got a high school degree. But you'll be maybe 2 times better off, not 30 times better off. So what caused it? If it's neither the left's favorite theory or the right's favorite theory, what is the correct theory? And the correct theory is that there was a massive free lunch that made us rich in the form of innovations that we see all around us. Electric lights, inexpensive steel, flooring that's inexpensive, projectors. How many shoes do you have? Now I've actually got quite a few. I'm the Imelda Marcos of Chicago. But your ancestors had 1 pair of shoes, if they had any shoes at all. So it's innovation in making shoes, making food. Here's a nice example. In 1800, 80% of the American population, free and slave, was on farms. 4 out of 5 people were on farms. And they were able to feed themselves, and the other 20%, not as well as we eat now, I mean, just look at my girth here, but reasonably well by international standards, okay? So 4 out of 5 people work to make the food. Now, the American population on farms is about 2% of the entire population. 2% of the American population makes vastly more food and fiber than our ancestors in 1800 did. I mean, by a factor of 200. It's an astonishing increase in how much better off we are. The same holds for education. Once, university education was a rare privilege for the upper classes, for those who had the leisure because their parents were rich, that they didn't have to go immediately to work when they were 14. My great-grandfather on my father's side was a freight conductor on the Milwaukee Road Railway, which means the boss of a big freight train. My other grandfather was an electrician, and neither of them went to college. My father, the son of the freight conductor, became a professor at Harvard. Not too bad for the son of a freight conductor. And that's what happened. There was this enormous change, and now we're very rich, and it came from ideas. Ideas for novelties. Ideas, organizational novelties. One of my favorite examples is containerization. You see these trucks on the road that have, Chinese characters on the side, or you see trains. We saw one just yesterday going through town. Enormous long trains, such as my grandfather might have supervised, that consist entirely of stacked boxes that came off of ships in Long Beach and are on their way to, to Charleston. And that idea was invented, was thought up by a North Carolina trucking firm owner who was a poor boy and didn't get to go to college. And it's a brilliant idea. It doesn't involve any science. You don't have to be a genius to think, well, you know, we know how to make steel, and we know how to stack containers on ships. Let's do that. It's an organizational idea. It wasn't science. In fact, it wasn't science that made us rich on the whole, although science is getting more and more important. So where do the ideas come from? And here I'll come to the end, and I want you to think up things to ask me. Where did these ideas come from? Why did we have to wait? Now here we are again at 1800, and you remember the technical vocabulary for this factor of 30. Why did it wait until then? Why didn't it happen in China? In 1492, if you were going to bet on where the great enrichment was going to occur, you'd bet the farm on China. Because China in 1492 had the best technology, the best property laws, the best peaceful existence of any country in the world. It had the best science, too. And it would have been the place, but it wasn't. It happened in northwestern Europe. As I said, first in Holland, then in England and Scotland, the English New World. Why? Here's the answer. In a word, I'm going to teach you a new word, or a new way to use an old word, liberalism. By which I don't mean the slow socialism that our friends on the left, like Bernie Sanders, talk about, or Hillary Clinton. I don't mean that rather strange modification of the word liberal that took place in the late 19th century and early 20th in Britain and the United States. I mean the old meaning. Adam Smith, now look, I have to cross myself again. Adam Smith called it, hear this phrase, the liberal plan of social equality, economic liberty, and legal justice. That's equality in society, equality in opening a hairdressing salon, and equality before the law. It was an egalitarian impulse. It was called, and is still called outside the United States, liberalism. Now, why would that be the cause of all these great ideas like containerization and dropped ceiling and electric lights and the computer and blah, blah, blah? Why would it be the cause? It's very simple. The economics, once you've got this idea and have thought about it and have looked into the evidence, it's rather obvious. What liberalism does is it frees people from hierarchies. No longer domination of women by men. No longer domination of slaves by owners. No longer domination of serfs by lords. No longer domination of workers by bosses. Until the 19th century, it was commonplace to beat apprentices, sailors, employees, your wives. It was commonplace. Then it stopped. Because we got the idea that all men and women, dear, are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I don't need to point out that these words were written by a slaveholder who didn't free his slaves even after he died. So there are tensions and inadequate creations of these equal liberal liberties. But they keep happening. Gay people get freed. Handicapped people get freed. Women get freed. Poor people get freed. Jews get freed. Muslims, when they come to the United States, get freed. Freer people, it turns out, there's nothing in the nature of logic to show that this has to be so, but it is so. Free people are ingenious. Free people, in the English phrase, are willing to have a go. And if you're willing to have a go, and everyone's willing to have a go, and you've made everyone free, and you've taken everyone out of these damn permanent hierarchies. If you're a milkmaid to begin with, you stay one for your whole life. If you take people out of that, they try stuff out. They do things. We are a free people in this room. We have the ability. We're not always going to succeed. Our dreams are not always going to come true. But we have the ability to try. Whereas in 1800, in most of the world, you didn't have the ability to try. You were someone's wife, passed from being a daughter to your father, passed without freedom. And then if you were a mill girl in New England, you had this period between being subordinated to your father where you could go work for your own wages in a wool mill. So that's my story. Liberty caused the modern world. Not capital accumulation, not exploitation, not savings, not slavery, but freedom caused the modern world. And if we want to, look, it'd be harder for me to make this argument if a little bit of economic freedom hadn't worked so very well in China after 1978. In about another generation, China will probably, if it doesn't screw it up, and it probably will, in another generation, China's going to have the same income as the United States, which is all to the good for everyone, for us, for them. In a couple of generations, maybe 3, India is going to have the same income as the United States. And that's a great and wonderful thing. I expect the whole world to become rich. And I expect we'll see sub-Saharan Africa, I'm very optimistic about for the long run. And I see the whole world as having the opportunities that everyone in this room has had, coming as a student or an employee to Clemson. So that's my story. Liberty is how we got rich, and liberty is how we can stay rich. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm gonna sit here because I'm old and feeble. And if you have questions, wait until, if you have to leave, that's fine. If you have questions, raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come and give it to you, because the questions are being recorded. Let's wait until those who have to go have gone, and then we happy few can have a little conversation. I have a sense these are the people who were assigned by their instructor to come. That's okay. That's why we have classes. If you could move out with some alacrity, that would help. Could you, I hope you've been thinking about questions. State your name when you give your question so that we can pursue you to your dormitory and persecute you if you have a bad question. No, we're not going to make fun of anyone here. You're very welcome. It's free. Actually, there's no such thing as a free lunch in the short run. There's an opportunity cost of staying here. You could be going to, I don't know, something else. Okay, let's have some questions, inquiries, thoughts. What I should have done is what I sometimes do when I give a lecture, which is to remind the students at the beginning, the best way to listen to a lecture is to think of a question as the lecture happens. Actually, I ought to tell a story. It's a Harvard story. Radcliffe was the women's college attached to Harvard. And in 1955, the women at Radcliffe started to come to Harvard classes, which formerly had had only men. And before that, the Harvard professors would go over and teach in the Radcliffe yard to women only. But they were going to do in 1955 co-education that most of the state universities had adopted 100 years before. So anyway, that's what happened at Harvard. And there was one professor who really didn't like having young women in his class. And this was the height of Freudianism. Freud said that everything's about sex. Sex, 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 that's all it is. And this professor, there was a young woman who used to listen to his lectures in the front row knitting. She didn't take notes. She knit. Now actually, eventually I learned this is a very good way to listen to a lecture. You got something to do with your hands, and you're actually thinking of what the professor's saying. Instead of, the professor would come in and say hello, and I'd write down hello. Really stupid. And I kept doing that into graduate school, and finally it occurred to me. But anyway, she comes to the class, and in the third class, he can't stand it anymore that she's knitting. And he points to her and says, now remember, this is Freud, 666, and says, young woman, do you know that knitting is a form of masturbation? And there's this shocked thing in the room. And without missing a stitch, she looks up at him and says, Professor, you do it your way, I'll do it mine. So now, whether that actually happened is somewhat in doubt, but it should have happened. Okay, dears, have at me.
Hi, is this working? Hi, my name's Steve Marks, and I wondered whether you believe that the Democratic policies related to either Clinton or Sanders that you mentioned before really hinder our ability to innovate, as you implied, when a few minutes later you suggest that countries with far more intrusive governments like China are growing, innovating quickly.
Well, that's the great question. Singapore is another example of a tyranny. He and his father jailed their opponents, still do. And China is certainly a tyranny and it's becoming worse.
Don't allow chewing gum in Singapore either.
What's that again?
They don't allow chewing gum in Singapore either.
Exactly, they certainly don't. You get whipped if you chew chewing gum. But most tyrannies are economic disasters. Let's get that straight. Just as an empirical regularity, Zimbabwe is a tyranny, and it's one of the poorest countries in the world. North Korea is a tyranny, and it is the poorest country in the world. So it's not as if this China model that she is the premier of China, has been advertising, tyranny combined with economic liberalism always works. Usually the tyranny brings the country down to economic catastrophe. But of course, if you can imitate other countries, then you can get along with a certain amount of tyranny for a long time. And that's what the Chinese have done. Now, but remember, the other big example of a very fast-growing country is India. It's growing at 5.5%, 4.5% per capita since 1990. And that's pretty damn good. And India is a democracy. It's kind of crazy. It's a somewhat insane democracy, but it's a democracy. It's a free country. It's got a free press and everything. So I think that in the long run, as we saw in Taiwan and South Korea, and then earlier in Hong Kong, before it was taken over back by the Chinese, freedom of a comprehensive sort eventually becomes what bourgeois people want. And I think that'll happen in China. The problem with what the Chinese Communist Party has is getting off the tiger. Sorry, I don't mean the Clemson tiger. But if you're riding the tiger, everything's cool. You know, you're going along on the tiger. Hey, look, this is wonderful. If you fall off the tiger, you get eaten, right, by the tiger. So the Communist Party has to figure out how to get off the tiger. And so far, they're not doing that too well. But I see the source of high income and innovation as liberty. And I expect India is going to do very well in the long run.
Hi. Hey, I have a question.
Yes, I take it you do, but what's your name?
Over here, on your left. Excuse me?
Ask your question.
Okay.
What's the matter?
Hi, everybody. Hope you have a great day. So my name is Brandon Bozeman, and my question it pertains to the bourgeois that you mentioned
I don't
earlier.
care what it pertains to. Ask it.
Okay, so I would like to know if you are familiar with the modern colloquial term of bougie, and what is your take on it in relevance to the bourgeois? It means to act high class.
I'm not understanding your question. Ask it again, Bill. No, don't laugh. I mean, he's a serious person. At least he's asked a question. Did you? Come on, ask a question.
Over here.
See, I don't even know where the hell he is. Is he over there? I thought he was there, but the lights are blinding him. No, I can't. Okay, but please ask your question, dear.
So I would like to know if you're familiar with the modern colloquial term of bougie, and what's your take on it in relevance to the bourgeois?
Well, it does, because all these terms of contempt for the middle class are all of a piece. You know, Burgee and what's his name talked about the bourgeois. Anyway, it's very easy to make fun of the middle class. Say, oh, they're materialistic. They're unlike me. I'm not materialistic. I have 8,000 books. What does that mean? I mean, what am I talking about? Of course I'm materialistic. I have a friend who's a theologian, a very good theologian named Hart, and he had 20,000 books. Yet he's against capitalism. And I said, dear, come on, you're in favor of buying stuff. So yeah, it's too easy to sneer at people. And we got to stop doing that. I think quite generally in American politics. We have to stop sneering at each other and try to listen to each other. And that's what my books are about. We should listen to capitalism and what it's actually trying to do. People think, oh, it's terrible you earn profit, but you only earn profit if you satisfy people. That's the only way to earn profit. If you're a knight, you steal it. If you're a priest, you can appropriate it through the tithe. But if you're bourgeois, if you're a business person, you only get it by being nice to people, by offering service. Come on, for the honor of Clemson.
I'm over here.
Where are you? Tell me where you are.
No.
They're pointing this way. Those people are pointing this way.
I'm over here.
Thank you. Oh, good. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Hello, Dr. McCloskey. I'm in front
Oh,
of you.
there you are. Good. Now I can see you.
Yeah. My name is Aditya Swani. I just want to say thank you for taking the time to come speak with us today.
I'm very pleased to.
I have two questions. My first question is, when you say that liberty is the reason that our society and many of the societies of the world has become wealthy, are you speaking specifically about economic liberty, or are you talking about economic liberty and political liberty?
Well, that's a very good and interesting question. Because obviously in the case of China, it's economic liberty, and not political liberty. But liberty is of a piece. Allowing people to engage in their projects, so long as these people don't use physical violence to stop your project, is what we mean by liberty of all kinds. I have a project of starting a newspaper and saying nasty things about the administration. Well, that's my project. And as long as I'm not beating up on you, you got to leave me alone, according to Adam Smith's liberal plan. So they're not. We commonly distinguish between political liberty and economic liberty, and then say, oh, well, but economic liberty is unimportant. We should tax people and regulate people and stop them from doing stuff. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a formula for a bigger and bigger role for the state, and the state is not your friend. You know the three most unbelievable sentences in English?
No.
They are, the check is in the mail. Of course I'll respect you in the morning. And I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. Okay, now what's your next question?
My second question is, what do you think should be done with regards to the rise of illiberal democracies today?
Well, that's another very deep question, and I'm going to be speaking next week to a conference in Sweden, and we're going to be talking about populism. And indeed, in the spring, I'm going to go to Hungary and get an honorary degree from a university there. And Hungary is one of the examples of illiberal democracy. This guy, Orbán, is a real terrible man. And Putin is a terrible man. And very mysteriously, our president likes him. I don't know what's going on there. And the Erdogan in Turkey is a terribly bad man. And all these bad men, I notice they're all men, they say illiberal democracy. And that's populism. Huey Long in Louisiana was a populist and a tyrant. And there are models of this. There's Mussolini, was popular. Hitler was eventually voted in by the German people. So we can't depend on majority rule as the only index of whether a country is good or not. We need liberal democracies. I'm in favor of democracies, although the great American journalist H.L. Mencken said, democracy is the theory that ordinary people know what they want and deserve it good and hard. But I think, look, the great management theorist of the 1920s, and now I'm going to forget her name again. Darn, I wish I could remember her name, because she's just terrific. And she's the inventor of the phrase win-win. She coined it in the 1920s. And she said democracy is the art of finding win-wins. Look, when we got the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts in 1964 and 65, those were wins for everybody. Some people in the South didn't agree. But actually, most people in the South, in the end, did come to agree. And they were win-wins. So that's really what democracy is. It's the theory of a free society if it's not just majority vote.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Who else? I have to see who it is.
Hello, Dr. McCloskey. I'm to your left, up high.
Oh, thanks. Hi.
My name is Steve Spearman, and I first want to give you my liberal credentials, if you will. I love your books, and I love your theory, and you've influenced me in a lot of ways about...
This is a man of taste.
Yeah.
I want you to listen to him.
Notice the hoodie, that's, you can tell. So, but anyway, to establish my second, I'm actually skeptical of Piketty. I'm skeptical, but I think the concern about growing income inequality as potentially being destabilizing, I don't think you can dismiss that either, and I'm curious what you think about that. So.
Well, I can dismiss it because world inequality, if you think of the individual distribution of income, which ought to be what we care about, is falling dramatically and has in the last 30 years more or less every year. So world inequality, the Gini coefficient, if you want, for the world as a whole, taking each individual as a person, as an element of this, has been falling. I have a 50-page review of Piketty's book, which you can find on my website, which is deirdremccloskey.org. And I go after the guy. I think his book was a brave one, and he's no fool, and he's not lazy, that's for sure. But in the end, I concluded it was wrong, comprehensively wrong. And as you said, the fear of inequality and the stirring up of the worry about it has danger in politics. We don't want to indulge envy. Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, and like many of the other deadly sins, gluttony, for example, it's insatiable. If you start envying other people and want to cut down the tall poppies and so on, you're in terrible shape. I mean, spiritually you are, and if everybody's envious, we're in real trouble. There's a story from the Czech lands. It goes like this. St. Peter and Jesus go out and go around to peasant households and ask for a meal and a place to sleep for the night, shelter for the night. And people reject them. Go away, you bums. Go away, go away. But this one generous family says, oh, yes, come on in. And they feed St. Peter and Jesus, who they don't recognize. And the next morning, Jesus reveals himself. And he says to the peasant man, because you've been good, you can have anything you want. And the husband and wife consult in whispers for a few minutes. And then the man comes to Jesus and he says, my neighbor has a goat which gives them milk every day. And Jesus anticipates and says, so you want a goat too? No, I want you to kill the neighbor's goat. And that's this hideous, envious equality. Where are you? Wave if you want to be recognized. Oh yeah, go ahead, dear. Yeah, you put the microphone, think of rock music. Put the microphone close to your lips. I still can't hear you, dear. Have you got a microphone? Put it close to your lips. Have you ever seen a rock musician?
It's still on this one. The one on the left.
Now you're in business. There we go.
My name is Diamante, and my position is basically now 200 years ago they used to barter goods, and now we value cash. So either that has a lot to do with the growth in our economy.
I can't understand what you're saying, dear. Say it again. Say it slowly.
200 years ago, I guess you could say we used to barter goods or we use cash.
Barter?
Yeah, trading goods. Like I'll trade you like a pound of rice for a pound.
No, that's not true. That we
Maybe
didn't.
farther back, you know what I'm saying? Farther back in the time period, is what I'm saying, but even that has more to do with the growth of macroeconomics using cash.
No, that's nonsense. I mean, I
At
don't.
the time, they didn't have cash like the U.S. dollar.
I don't like to be cruel, but it's wrong. All societies have money.
I understand your point, but what I'm saying is a long time ago before they had like some semblance of the U.S. dollar.
No, that's false, dear. In the free banking era, individuals could issue their own notes as money. That was in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in the United States. And in any case, barter has never been an important part of any economy. There's always a form of money. In ancient Mesopotamia, you'd carry around a coil of silver, and when you wanted to buy something, you'd chop something off, and the merchant would measure it in a scale. In any case, in East Africa, cattle were money. Anything can serve as money. In prisoner of war camps during the Second World War, cigarettes were money. And when the Red Cross package came at the first of the month, there'd be this great inflation because they'd been smoking up the money supply in the meantime. So it's money, as we say in economics, is basically a veil. I mean, it can screw up things royally. I agree with you. If you overinflate, if you make too much money, no, not make. That's not how to put it. If you print too much money, you can get into terrible shape. Venezuela is doing that right now. But no, there's no transition from barter to a commercial economy. And I know you've been told this in your history courses, but it's wrong. Anglo-Saxon England was a thoroughly monetized economy. They paid this enormous bribe to my ancestors, the Vikings, to keep them out of England so they wouldn't enslave my other ancestors, the English. I don't know to whom to apply for reparations. But in any case, money is not crucial to this story. Ingenuity is. Human creativity. Human liberty above all.
Can I say that one more thing?
What's that again?
Can I say that one more thing while I was thinking before I talk one more question I had?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so basically 500 years ago, if you went to Spain to trade something, you won't be able to do it as easily as you would say with cash, is what I'm trying to say, if you went for the first time.
Somebody told you that, but they're wrong.
Okay.
I'm an economic historian.
I understand that.
I've studied this thing very
So
extensively.
if you were from Spain, you went to America to talk to the Indians to make a trade, they wouldn't have any value for cash 500 years ago.
Sure, they use wampum.
But you wouldn't know that necessarily, though.
I would. I mean, are you talking about me or are you talking about them?
I'm talking about Christopher Columbus, for example.
He had ways to trade with the Indians.
I understand that.
He also had guns so he could shoot them.
Yeah, that was my point, though.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, it's not that,
They didn't trade money, cash, is what I was trying to say.
look, the big problem of first contact with Europe was that accidentally Europeans gave the First Nations smallpox and measles, and 90% of them died. Once the Amazonian basin was densely populated, Amazon, which now has very few people in it. I'm going to go to Brazil next week and talk about it. And yet, what happened was not got anything to do with trade or anything or money. It had to do with disease.
Professor McCloskey on
Okay.
your left.
Yes, dear.
Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.
And my question has to deal with,
Just ask the question, dear.
okay.
Don't tell me what it has to deal with. That, by
I
the
see
way,
a-
is general advice.
I see a corollary between your description of how agriculture techniques allowed people
Yeah,
to be more productive
you bet.
and with the military. And even though we don't have the largest per person military, we're still the most powerful
We are
military.
indeed.
But would you, in terms of like the moral problem of like privatizing the military in a sense, because you speak of it as like a service just as any
Yeah.
other economic service.
Yeah, it is.
Which it is.
Yeah, I agree.
But is there not some moral injustice in putting this great responsibility on such a small amount of people just because they're willing to?
Well, you know, I grew up in the Vietnam era, and I remember very well the draft, where people I came from a mill town in Massachusetts, and my friends who I had played with as a kid, if they were poor and sons of people who worked in the mills, they got drafted and went to Vietnam and got killed. The sons of manufacturers and lawyers and indeed Harvard professors had no chance of that happening to them. So I think the volunteer army is a very good idea. Now I see what you mean by it's you could think of it as a disproportionate burden, but on the other hand, people go into the military voluntarily. And people, for example, go into the fire department voluntarily, or the police.
But sort of your point of contention when you were debating Senator Graham was like, why are we such a
800 faces overseas.
Exactly, and it's because there's this moral disconnect where it doesn't affect, like,
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the problem. If you don't have a mass draft army, no one has an incentive to keep the military small, at least small in power and expenditure. Yeah, you're right. This is a point that President Eisenhower made in his famous farewell address. The military-industrial complex, which is very active here in South Carolina, is a more or less direct result, you could argue, of the disconnect between kids, your kid dying and some other kid dying, if you see what I mean. I mean, I suggest that Lindsey Graham go fight in Iraq if he's so enthusiastic about it. He's a smart guy, and I admire him in a lot of ways. But it's a bunch of old men, especially men, who are sending kids off to die in foreign fields. So I'm a liberal in that sense too. I don't want war to be the main thing that we do. Now, in a way, it's the main job of a government to protect us. But this talk that you hear a lot about people going overseas to protect us, no, they're not. They're going to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a threat to the United States. Canada and Mexico are. If we're worried about invasion, we need to be concerned about those damn Canadians in their toques coming over and with their ice hockey sticks and attacking us. And that I'm prepared to have an army or a Coast Guard against, or those damn Mexicans. They'll come over and sing to us in a charming way.
I think the last point before I
Yeah,
want
go
to
ahead.
yield the floor is that I agree with you that capitalism is a positive thing, but I see it as a net benefit as opposed. I was wondering, judging from your talk,
Yeah.
it seemed as you believe it's a absolute good.
Well, no, it's not an absolute good. There's no absolute good in this vale of tears.
Okay.
We're all sinful. You know, I'm a realist in that sense.
Okay.
We're not perfect. But, and there are some good things about aristocracy, and there are some good things about theocracy, and there are some good things about crony capitalism even, and some good things about, I don't know what, socialism. But yes, I say on balance, liberal capitalism is what you would want. There's a nice way of putting that, which is to say, following the golden rule. Capitalism follows the golden rule. Don't do unto others what you wouldn't want to have done to yourself. And you wouldn't want someone to restrict your right to open a hairdressing salon if you want to. And it's not the golden rule of the football player from Florida State on the eve of the Florida game who said some time ago, I follow the golden rule. Do unto others before they do it unto you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, dear.
Please join me. Please join us for refreshments out of the way. Thank you for coming.